Dad banned me from the house until I apologized to my golden child sister. I simply said fine. The following morning, I was gone, and what came after devastated them all. The words hit me like a physical blow, stripping away everything I thought I knew about family. At 17, my own father looked me in the eye and gave me an ultimatum that would shatter my life: apologize or leave. The air in the dining room hung heavy, suffocating, thick with unspoken resentment. My mom fiddled with her napkin, refusing to meet my gaze, while my sister, Chloe, just offered a smug, triumphant smirk. His terms were simple: apologize to Chloe for ruining her college acceptance party, or find somewhere else to live. My crime? I'd laughed. It just escaped before I could stop it, a small, involuntary sound. Because, honestly, the idea of my parents throwing a catered dinner party to celebrate Chloe getting into a local community college, treating it like she'd gotten into Princeton, was beyond absurd. Especially when my actual early acceptance to Princeton 5 months prior had only earned a quiet, "That's nice, sweetheart," over takeout Chinese. Dad's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. "You have until tomorrow morning," he spat, "to decide if you want to be part of this family." I looked at him, then at Chloe's satisfied expression, then at my mom, who just kept her eyes glued to her napkin. "All right," I said quietly. The silence that followed should have been their first warning. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't slam doors or scream about how unfair it all was. I just walked upstairs, pulled out the duffel bag I'd been secretly packing for weeks, and added the last few essentials. They probably thought I'd crack by midnight, that I'd come downstairs in tears, begging forgiveness for daring to exist in Chloe's shadow. Dad had done this before, threatened to throw me out over increasingly petty things, always banking on my fear of abandonment to keep me compliant. This time, he'd miscalculated. Badly. My Aunt Eleanor picked me up at 4:47 a.m. Her ancient Volvo idled at the corner, exactly where I'd asked her to wait. She'd been expecting my call for months, ever since I'd confided in her about the growing favoritism. Unlike my parents, Eleanor had actually read my Princeton acceptance letter, and she'd wept with pride. "You sure about this, honey?" she asked as I tossed my bag into the back. Positive. We drove 5 hours to her cabin outside Salem, Oregon. By the time my parents woke up and found my room empty, with just a note saying, "I made my choice," I was already helping Eleanor replant her vegetable garden, my phone off and buried deep in my bag. I didn't know it then, but that morning would become the dividing line in my family's history. The before and after. The moment everything they'd built their lives around began to crumble. The first crack appeared within a week. Eleanor told me later, laughing into her tea, how Mom had called her in hysterics, demanding to know where I was. When Eleanor calmly explained that I was safe and had no intention of returning, Mom apparently shrieked that I was being dramatic and needed to come home immediately to apologize properly. "I told her you weren't a performing monkey," Eleanor said, grinning. She hung up on me. What my parents hadn't anticipated was how visibly my absence would affect their carefully curated image. Neighbors asked questions. Church friends wondered why I wasn't at Sunday services. Mom's book club grew curious when she made increasingly elaborate excuses for my whereabouts. Chloe's graduation party that June was apparently a disaster. Everyone kept asking where I was, because I'd always been at family events. Dad tried to say I was busy with college preparations, but that excuse wore thin when people pointed out that Princeton didn't start until September. Mom finally admitted I was staying with relatives for the summer. The gossip mills churned. One of Mom's closest friends, Ms. Harrison, apparently cornered her in the grocery store parking lot and asked point-blank if they'd thrown me out. Mom's non-denial was damning enough. The story spread like wildfire through their social circle. Meanwhile, I was thriving. Eleanor's cabin became my sanctuary. I got a job at a local bookstore, started writing the novel I'd always dreamed about, and spent evenings on the porch, watching the sunset over the nearby lake. For the first time in years, I could breathe without waiting for someone to tell me I was doing it wrong. Princeton sent my orientation packet to Eleanor's address, where I'd forwarded all my mail. When she handed me the thick envelope with its crimson logo, she squeezed my shoulder. Your parents are idiots for not recognizing what they had. I realized something then. I didn't miss them. Not even a little. The grief I'd expected never came. Instead, I felt lighter, unencumbered by the constant need to earn affection that should have been freely given. August brought the second major crack in my parents' façade. Chloe started at community college and apparently hated it within a week. She'd expected the royal treatment she received at home, but her professors were unimpressed by her entitlement. When she complained to Dad that her English instructor had given her a C on her first essay, he actually called the school to dispute the grade. The dean's response was apparently legendary. Dad got a lecture about helicopter parenting and academic integrity that ended with a warning about filing frivolous complaints. Mom told Eleanor, during one of their increasingly hostile phone calls, that Dad had been humiliated by some pencil-pushing bureaucrat. Eleanor's reply was priceless. Maybe he should focus less on Chloe's mediocrity and more on repairing his relationship with his Princeton-bound daughter. Mom hung up on her again. What I learned later, through Eleanor's network of friends who still spoke to my parents, was that the community college incident sparked something darker in their marriage. Dad had apparently exploded at Mom after the dean's call, blaming her for raising Chloe to believe the world would bend to her whims. Mom fired back that he was the one who had insisted on throwing that ridiculous celebration dinner, trying to make Chloe's ordinary achievement seem extraordinary. The real issue, though, ran deeper than one bad grade or one embarrassing phone call. My absence had exposed the fundamental rot in their family system. For years, they'd operated under an unspoken agreement. Chloe was the beloved princess who could do no wrong, and I was the capable workhorse who existed to make everyone else look good. My grades, my achievements, my potential, all of it had been background noise to Chloe's mediocrity. But now the workhorse was gone. And the princess had no one to outshine. Chloe's failures became impossible to ignore or excuse away. Every bad grade, every skipped class, every complaint about how hard everything was, it all highlighted what they'd lost when they chose her over me. According to Ms. Harrison, who apparently stayed friendly with Eleanor even after distancing herself from my parents, their social circle had started fragmenting. People who'd once admired their close family unit now saw the cracks. Dad's golf buddies made uncomfortable jokes about kids these days. Mom's book club meetings grew tense whenever someone mentioned their own children's college successes. The Millers, whose daughter went to UCLA, apparently stopped inviting my parents to their monthly dinner parties. Mrs. Miller had asked Mom directly why I wasn't coming home for holidays, and Mom's evasive answer had been so transparently false that it ended the friendship right there. When you build your social capital on the illusion of a perfect family, the truth becomes toxic. Financially, things were getting worse, too. Dad's business had been struggling since that client pulled out, but pride prevented him from admitting the scope of the problem. He'd taken out a loan to cover operating expenses, telling Mom it was temporary. 3 months later, another client left, citing philosophical differences after Dad made bitter comments about ungrateful children during a business lunch. Mom's part-time dental receptionist job barely covered groceries. Chloe contributed nothing, claiming she was too stressed from school to work, even though she was only taking 2 classes and failing both. The house they'd been so proud of, the one they'd bought to impress the neighbors, suddenly felt like an anchor dragging them underwater. I found out about some of this through an unexpected source, Chloe's former best friend, Sarah, who reached out to me on Facebook. We'd been friendly before I left, and she'd always seemed uncomfortable with how my parents treated me. Her message was long and detailed, an apology for not speaking up when it mattered and a confession about what she'd witnessed since. Sarah wrote that Chloe had become insufferable, constantly complaining about her life while refusing to do anything to improve it. She'd burned through their entire friend group with her negativity and entitlement. The final straw came when Chloe borrowed $200 from Sarah, promising to pay it back within a week, then blocked her when Sarah asked about it a month later. "Your sister is a nightmare," Sarah wrote. "And your parents created her. Everyone can see it now. I'm sorry I didn't tell you years ago that you deserved better." I thanked her for reaching out, but didn't engage beyond that. Sarah's apology was nice, but it didn't change the past. Still, it confirmed what I'd suspected. My family's reputation was in freefall, and they had no one to blame but themselves. The holidays that year were apparently disastrous. Mom had tried to recreate the picture-perfect Christmas she'd always orchestrated, but my absence was glaring. Extended family members kept asking about me. Aunt Eleanor had been explicitly uninvited, which caused its own drama when Mom's other sister, Aunt Carol, found out and called to lecture Mom about alienating the one relative who'd actually helped me. Uncle David, Dad's brother, apparently got drunk and asked point-blank why they'd kicked out their smart daughter and kept the dumb one. The evening ended with Dad throwing him out and Mom crying in the bathroom. Chloe, oblivious as always, posted smiling selfies with her presents, each one garnering fewer likes than the last as people grew tired of her performative happiness. Eleanor sent me a care package that Christmas with homemade cookies, a beautiful journal, and a card that made me sob. "Family isn't where you come from," it read. "It's who shows up. I'll always show up for you." September arrived with golden leaves and the excitement of new beginnings. Eleanor drove me to Princeton, helping me move into my dorm and meeting my roommate, a brilliant engineering student named Lena from Denver. As we unpacked, Eleanor pressed an envelope into my hands. "For emergencies," she said. Inside was a check for $5,000. When I tried to refuse, she shook her head firmly. "Your parents should have done this. Since they won't, I will. You're going to change the world, sweetheart. Don't let their blindness convince you otherwise." I sobbed into her shoulder for 20 minutes, finally allowing myself to mourn the parents I deserved but never had. Classes started, and I discovered that I'd underestimated how much my home life had been holding me back. Without the constant criticism and comparison to Chloe, my grades soared. I joined a literary magazine, made friends who valued me for my actual personality, and started dating a grad student named Noah who thought my ambitions were impressive rather than threatening. Back home, things deteriorated rapidly. Dad lost a major client in October after the guy apparently did some digging and learned about me. The client had a daughter at Princeton, too. When he casually mentioned it to Dad during a meeting, Dad's bitter response about ungrateful children apparently made the guy uncomfortable enough to take his business elsewhere. The financial hit was significant. Mom had to go back to work full-time at a dental office, something she apparently resented deeply since she'd quit working when Chloe was born to be a full-time mother. The irony that she'd never extended the same dedication to me wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. Chloe dropped 3 of her 5 classes by midterm, claiming the workload was unreasonable. She spent most of her time complaining on social media about how hard college was, which apparently embarrassed Dad enough that he asked her to make her accounts private. She refused, and they had their first major argument. Meanwhile, I made the dean's list my first semester with a 3.94 GPA. I didn't tell my parents, but Eleanor proudly posted about it on Facebook. Within hours, dozens of people who had watched me grow up were commenting congratulations and asking why my parents hadn't mentioned it. Mom called Eleanor in a rage, accusing her of trying to humiliate us. Eleanor's response, which she later recounted to me word for word, was magnificent. "I'm celebrating my niece's achievements. If that humiliates you, maybe examine why." Christmas came with an unexpected development. Mom sent a card to Eleanor's address with a stiff note asking if I'd be willing to come home for the holidays so we can be a family again. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what they'd done, just an expectation that I'd forget 4 months of abandonment because they wanted their picture-perfect Christmas. I sent back a polite decline. I'd already made plans to spend the holidays with Eleanor and her partner, Martha, who treated me with more parental warmth in an afternoon than my actual parents had shown in years. According to Martha, who still had mutual friends with my mother, Mom apparently cried through most of Christmas dinner. Dad drank too much and made uncomfortable jokes about kids these days, thinking they're too good for their families. Chloe posted a selfie with her presents, hashtagging it #blessed, while the comments section filled with people asking where I was. The thing about golden children is that they're rarely equipped to handle actual adversity. Chloe had been praised her entire life for being average, told she was special when she was merely ordinary. When real life failed to provide the same unconditional adoration, she crumbled. She dropped out of community college in January, telling my parents she needed to find herself. Translation: she wanted to sleep until noon, scroll social media until 3, and have mom do her laundry while contributing nothing. Dad apparently tried to put his foot down, insisting she needed to work or go back to school, but mom defended her sensitivity and need for time to adjust. The arguments between my parents intensified. Dad blamed mom's coddling for Chloe's failure to launch. Mom blamed Dad's pressure. Neither acknowledged their shared role in creating a spoiled, entitled young adult who'd never learned to handle disappointment. At Princeton, I was flourishing in ways I'd never imagined possible. My fiction professor submitted one of my short stories to a prestigious undergraduate literary journal, and it got accepted. When the published issue arrived, I held a magazine with my story inside and felt something shift in my chest. This was proof that I'd always had value, that my parents' inability to see it was their failure, not mine. Noah took me to dinner to celebrate. Over pasta and red wine, he asked about my family, and I found myself telling him everything. He listened quietly, his hand covering mine when my voice cracked. "They don't deserve you," he said simply. "Their loss is the world's gain." Spring semester brought another dean's list and an invitation to join an honors program focused on creative writing. I called Eleanor with the news, and she screamed so loudly that Martha came running from the other room thinking something was wrong. "We're getting margaritas to celebrate," Eleanor declared. "Come home for spring break, and we're making a weekend of it." Home. Funny how a cabin in Oregon had become home faster than the house where I'd spent 17 years. That spring break visit changed everything. We were at a local diner when I ran into Ms. Harrison, Mom's former friend. She hugged me tight, then held me at arm's length, studying my face. "You look happy," she said, sounding surprised. "Genuinely happy." "I am." She glanced at Eleanor, then back at me, something complicated crossing her face. "Your parents talk about Chloe constantly at church. You know, they never mention Princeton. Your writing. The amazing things you're doing. It's like you don't exist anymore." My throat tightened, but not with the pain I'd expected. Instead, I felt a strange sense of relief. They'd erased me from their narrative, which meant I was finally free to write my own story without their interference. "That's okay," I said, meaning it. "I'm not their story anymore." Ms. Harrison squeezed my hand. "For what it's worth, half the congregation thinks they're fools. The other half is just too polite to say it." News traveled fast in small towns. By evening, Eleanor got a voicemail from Mom, angrier than she'd apparently ever heard her. I listened to the message on speaker, Eleanor's finger hovering over the delete button. "How dare you parade her around town like some kind of trophy?" Mom hissed. "Everyone's talking about how much better she's doing without us. Like we're terrible parents. You're poisoning everyone against us. Tell her if she keeps humiliating this family, she'll never be welcome home again." The three of us sat in silence after the message ended. Finally, Martha spoke up. "She realizes she already kicked her out, right? This threat has no teeth." We laughed until tears streamed down our faces, the absurdity of it all breaking something loose. They'd already lost me. The threat of losing me again was meaningless. I went back to Princeton feeling more certain than ever that leaving had been the right choice. My second semester GPA was even higher than my first. I started working as a tutor, earning enough money that I didn't have to rely entirely on Eleanor's generosity. The literary magazine published 2 more of my stories. Noah and I got serious. He met Eleanor and Martha over video chat, and afterward, Eleanor texted me, "He's brilliant, and he looks at you like you hung the moon. Keep him." Summer came, and I stayed in California, subletting an apartment with Lena and working at a literacy nonprofit. The work was hard but meaningful, teaching reading skills to underprivileged kids who reminded me that family wasn't always about blood. Back home, Chloe got a job at the mall and was apparently fired within 3 weeks for chronic lateness. She moved on to a coffee shop, then a boutique, each job lasting slightly less time than the previous one. According to Eleanor's sources, Mom made excuses while Dad grew increasingly frustrated. Their marriage was fracturing. Dad spent longer hours at work, avoiding home. Mom buried herself in church activities and Chloe's drama. They existed in the same house but lived separate lives, united only by their shared refusal to admit they destroyed their family over pride and favoritism. My sophomore year began with an unexpected email from Dad. The subject line read, "We need to talk." And I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity won. The email was stiff, formal, nothing like how a father should write to his daughter. He claimed they missed me and wanted to move forward as a family. He mentioned that Chloe was going through a tough time and could use her big sister's support. He said Mom had been stressed and perhaps they'd all overreacted last year. Not once did he apologize. Not once did he acknowledge that they'd thrown me out for laughing. The entire email was framed as if I'd simply left for college and stayed away out of stubbornness rather than self-preservation. I read it 3 times, waiting to feel something. Anger, hurt, longing for reconciliation. Instead, I felt nothing but a distant sort of pity. They still didn't get it. They probably never would. My response was brief: "I appreciate you reaching out, but I'm not interested in resuming a relationship built on conditional love and scapegoating. I hope you find peace." Noah read it over my shoulder and whistled low. "Think they'll respond?" "No," I said. "They'll be too offended that I didn't fall at their feet with gratitude for this crumb of attention." I was right. Silence followed, confirming that their outreach had been less about actually repairing our relationship and more about appearances or alleviating their guilt. Thanksgiving approached, and I spent it with Noah's family in San Diego. His parents were warm and welcoming, asking genuine questions about my studies and aspirations. His younger sister showed me her own writing, asking shyly if I'd read it. Noah's mom, Olivia, hugged me goodbye and whispered, "You're always welcome here." Driving back to Princeton, Noah reached over and squeezed my hand. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, surprised to find it was true. "I really am." December brought a surprise, a letter from Chloe, handwritten on purple stationery covered in doodles. The writing was almost childlike, and the content was somehow both accusatory and pleading. She wrote that things had been really hard since I left, that Mom and Dad fought constantly, that everyone treated her differently. She claimed she didn't understand why I was punishing the whole family by staying away. She said she was sorry if she'd done something to upset me, but couldn't figure out what. The lack of self-awareness was staggering. After 2 pages of complaints about how my absence affected her, she ended with, "We're still your family. You can't just throw that away over nothing." Over nothing. My laughter echoed through my apartment, startling Lena in the next room. I threw the letter away without responding. Some bridges aren't worth rebuilding. My sophomore year ended with a summer research grant to study contemporary fiction writing techniques with one of the department's most acclaimed professors. The grant included housing and a stipend, meaning another summer away from Oregon at Eleanor's cabin. I called to apologize, but she was thrilled. "Baby, you're supposed to spread your wings. I'll visit in July, and you can show me around campus properly." That summer became a turning point in ways I couldn't have predicted. The research wasn't just academic, it was deeply personal. Professor Evans assigned us to write about our most painful memories, to mine our trauma for truth. "The best fiction," she said, "comes from places we're afraid to look." So I looked. I wrote about being 17 and invisible, about watching my parents celebrate mediocrity while ignoring excellence, about the relief of leaving and the unexpected absence of grief. The words poured out of me in a torrent, years of silence breaking like a dam. My workshop group sat in stunned silence after I read the first chapter. Finally, a graduate student named Ben spoke up. This isn't just good. This is necessary. People need to read this. The validation hit differently than any grade or award. These were serious writers telling me my pain had value, that my story mattered. I worked 16-hour days that summer, fueled by coffee and the desperate need to get it all out. Noah visited on weekends, bringing takeout and sitting quietly while I typed, his presence a comforting anchor. One Saturday night, after I'd been particularly silent during dinner, he set down his fork and looked at me intently. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Do you ever miss them? Your parents? I mean, even a little." I considered the question honestly. I miss the idea of them. The parents I deserved but never had. But the actual people? No. They showed me exactly who they were, and I believed them. He nodded slowly. My mom, Olivia, asked if you'd want them at our wedding someday. If we get married, I mean. His ears turned red. Not that I'm proposing, just, eventually. The thought of my parents at my wedding, watching me marry someone who actually loved me, trying to take credit for the woman I'd become despite them. It made my stomach turn. They lost the right to witness my happiness when they chose Chloe over me. Again and again and again. Good, Noah said firmly. Because you deserve people who show up, who've always shown up. Meanwhile, back in my hometown, the situation continued its downward spiral. Dad's business lost another client in June, this time because of his own behavior. He'd apparently shown up to a meeting hungover, been short-tempered with questions, and made several critical errors in the presentation. The client walked out halfway through and hired a competitor. Mom found out about the drinking when she discovered empty bourbon bottles hidden in Dad's office. The fight that followed was apparently explosive enough that neighbors heard it. Dad accused Mom of driving him to drink with her constant defense of Chloe's laziness. Mom screamed that he destroyed their family by refusing to apologize to me. The irony was lost on neither of them. They could see the problem, they just couldn't see their own role in creating it. Dad blamed Mom's coddling. Mom blamed Dad's rigidity. Neither could admit they'd both chosen wrong when they threw me out over a laugh. Chloe, for her part, had found a new boyfriend, a 24-year-old named Kevin, who worked part-time at the gas station and still lived with his parents. Mom was apparently thrilled that Chloe had someone special, choosing to ignore the red flags. Dad was less enthusiastic, but by that point, he'd given up trying to set standards. The boyfriend, Kevin, apparently moved into my old room within 3 months. My childhood bedroom, where I dreamed about Princeton and written stories late into the night, now housed a grown man who played video games until 4 in the morning and contributed nothing to household expenses. Eleanor told me this detail with barely concealed fury. They wouldn't let their brilliant daughter live at home because she laughed, but they're housing Chloe's loser boyfriend. The cognitive dissonance is Olympic level. I tried to feel angry, but mostly I felt sorry for them. They traded their daughter's potential for this, a failing business, a crumbling marriage, an entitled daughter with an even more entitled boyfriend living in their house like parasites. The punishment fit the crime, I suppose, though they'd never see it that way. Back at Princeton, my summer project turned into something bigger than I'd imagined. Professor Evans submitted it to a national competition for emerging writers. I didn't win, but I placed as a finalist, which came with publication in a prestigious quarterly called the Meridian Review and a $1,000 prize. The published piece caught attention within literary circles. Several established writers reached out with encouragement. My inbox filled with messages from readers who'd connected with the story. For the first time, I understood the power of honest writing, how vulnerability could create connection across distances. That fall, during my junior year, I focused on finishing my novel. The manuscript had grown to nearly 300 pages, each one excavating another layer of my experience. Professor Evans read pen drafts and pushed me to go deeper, to resist the urge to soften the hard truths. That summer was transformative. The research pushed my writing in directions I'd never considered, challenging me to experiment with structure and voice. The other grant recipients became close friends, all of us working late into the night, surviving on coffee and shared takeout. Noah graduated and got accepted to a PhD program at UCLA, just across the bay from Princeton. The night he told me, we celebrated on the roof of his apartment building, watching the city lights and talking about the future. We could get a place together in San Francisco next year, he said. You'd be close to campus. I'd be close to UCLA. And we could actually build a life together. I said yes without hesitation, ready to build a life with someone who valued me. Eleanor visited in July as promised, and I showed her everything, my favorite study spots, the creative writing building where I spent most of my time, the coffee shop where I'd written my best story. She met Noah and gave him her blessing with a fierce hug and a whispered threat about what would happen if he broke my heart. We had dinner at a fancy restaurant overlooking the bay, just the two of us. Eleanor raised her glass of wine. To you, sweetheart. To your brilliant mind, your gorgeous heart, and your courage to walk away from people who didn't deserve you. We clinked glasses, and I felt the last vestiges of doubt dissolve. I'd made the right choice. Every single time I'd chosen myself, and it had led me here, happy, successful, loved. What's happening back home? I asked, not because I cared deeply, but because I was curious. Eleanor's expression turned grim. Chloe moved back in after her fourth failed job. Your dad's blood pressure is apparently through the roof. Your mom's on anti-anxiety medication. They fight about money constantly since his business hasn't recovered. The whole thing's a mess, and they still blame me some days. Other days, they pretend you never existed. Ms. Harrison says it's like they've rewritten history. In their version, they only ever had one daughter, and she's tragically underappreciated by the world. The delusion was almost impressive. But that was the thing about people who couldn't accept responsibility. They'd always find someone else to blame, some alternate reality to retreat into. Junior year brought new challenges and greater achievements. I was appointed editor of the literary magazine, juggling that responsibility with my coursework and novel revision. The work was exhausting, but fulfilling in ways that validated every sacrifice I'd made. I moved in with Noah in San Francisco that September, creating a home that was truly ours. We painted the walls together, scoured thrift stores for furniture, and hosted dinner parties with friends who became chosen family. For the first time, I understood what home was supposed to feel like. Chloe somehow found my phone number and started sending occasional texts, usually late at night, usually complaints about how unfair her life was. I blocked her after the third message that blamed me for abandoning the family and making everything harder. My academic advisor called me into her office in November with news that made my hands shake. One of my stories had been nominated for a major undergraduate writing award with a $10,000 prize. Even if I didn't win, the nomination itself was prestigious enough to strengthen graduate school applications. This is extraordinary work, Professor Evans said, tapping the printed manuscript. You have a real future in this field if you want it. I wanted it more than anything. That story, ironically, was about a girl who leaves her toxic family and discovers herself in the process. I poured my truth into fiction, and now it was being recognized. The awards ceremony was in February. Eleanor and Martha flew out, and Noah wore a suit. I didn't win first place, but I took second, which came with $5,000 in validation that fueled my ambition for months. At the reception afterward, a literary agent named Evelyn Thorne approached me. I loved your piece, she said, handing me her card. When you finish your novel, I'd love to see it. I think you have something special. I took her card with trembling hands, tucking it carefully into my purse like a talisman. Noah kissed me in the parking lot, lifting me off my feet. You're going to be famous, and I'll tell everyone I knew you when. Senior year was a whirlwind of applications to MFA programs, finishing my novel manuscript, and preparing for life after Princeton. I applied to programs across the country, each application a step toward a future I was building brick by careful brick. By spring, my novel was complete, revised, polished, ready. I sent it to Evelyn Thorne with a carefully crafted query letter, then waited in agony for 3 weeks. Her response came via phone call. I stayed up until 3 a.m. reading this. I couldn't put it down. I want to represent you. I cried right there in our San Francisco apartment while Noah held me. This was it. Professional validation. Proof that I'd been worth investing in all along. Acceptance letters started arriving from MFA programs in March, Texas Writers Workshop, University of Washington, NYU. Each envelope felt like vindication, proof that I'd been worth investing in all along. I chose Washington partly for the program's excellent reputation and partly because Seattle would put me closer to Eleanor, who had been my true parent when I needed one most. Noah and I would manage the distance. We'd proven we could handle challenges together. My Princeton graduation was the happiest day of my life up to that point. Eleanor and Martha were there, screaming themselves hoarse when I walked across the stage. Noah's parents came too, having essentially adopted me. Professor Evans gave me a hug and made me promise to stay in touch. My parents weren't there. I hadn't invited them. They sent a card with a stiff congratulatory note and a check for $50, as if that could somehow make up for 4 years of absence. I donated the money to the literacy nonprofit where I'd worked. The $50 check became something of a dark joke among my friends. Noah's mom, Olivia, was particularly incensed. $50 for a Princeton graduation? That's what you give your dentist's kid for high school. She'd given me $1,000 as a graduation gift along with a letter welcoming me to their family. Professor Evans threw me a private celebration at her house, inviting my closest friends and mentors. She gave a toast that made everyone cry. I've taught writing for 23 years, and I can count on one hand the students who have what it takes to make it professionally. You're one of them. Your family's loss is literature's gain. The contrast was striking. Here were people who had known me for 4 years celebrating my achievements with genuine pride and investment. Meanwhile, my parents, who'd known me my entire life, had sent a token check and a card that could have been addressed to anyone. That night, back at my apartment, I found myself going through old photos on my laptop. There was one from my high school graduation where I graduated valedictorian. In the photo, Mom and Dad stood stiffly on either side of me while Chloe slouched in the background, clearly bored. Nobody was smiling. They'd left immediately after, skipping the reception because Chloe had wanted to go to the mall. I compared it to the photos from my Princeton graduation, dozens of them, full of genuine joy and celebration. Eleanor's face beaming with pride. Noah's parents hugging me like I was their own daughter. Professor Evans with her arm around my shoulders, looking at me like I'd just conquered the world. The difference was undeniable. One photo showed obligation. The others showed love. A week after graduation, while I was packing up my apartment, I got a Facebook message from someone I didn't recognize. The profile belonged to a woman named Clara Miller, who introduced herself as a former colleague of my father's. She apologized for reaching out, but said she felt I deserved to know what people were saying. Apparently, Dad had shown up to a professional networking event drunk and spent an hour complaining bitterly about his ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned the family. He told anyone who would listen that I'd gone to Princeton and gotten too big for my britches, that I thought I was better than everyone. Clara had listened politely, then asked why he wasn't celebrating having a daughter at Princeton. Dad's response was telling. She chose that school despite us to show off. She could have gone somewhere local and been part of the family, but she had to prove she was special. The delusion was breathtaking. In his mind, my acceptance to one of the world's best universities wasn't an achievement. It was an act of rebellion against him. My success wasn't something to be proud of. It was a personal attack. Clara ended her message with an observation that hit hard. I've met hundreds of professionals over my career, and I've never seen someone so threatened by their own child's potential. I'm sorry you didn't get the father you deserved, but from what I've heard about your accomplishments, you didn't need him anyway. I thanked her for telling me and shared the message with Noah. He read it twice, his jaw tightening. He's jealous of his own daughter. That's sick. That's always been the problem, I said quietly. They didn't want a successful daughter. They wanted a grateful one, someone who would make them look good without outshining them. I committed the cardinal sin of having ambitions that exceeded their comfort level. The summer before graduate school brought unexpected developments on multiple fronts. Evelyn submitted my novel to publishers in June. The waiting period stretched my nerves thin, but I tried to focus on preparing for Washington. When the first offer came in July, I was helping Eleanor paint her kitchen. My phone rang, Evelyn's name lighting up the screen, and I nearly dropped it in the paint tray. "We have an offer," she said. $15,000 for world rights. It's a good house. Reputable, with strong distribution. What do you think? My voice came out as a whisper. Yes. Absolutely. Yes. I called Noah first. He screamed so loudly that his lab mates in UCLA apparently came running. Then I called Eleanor, who cried and got paint in her hair. Finally, I called Professor Evans, who said simply, "I knew it. I always knew it." The news spread through Princeton's creative writing department quickly. My story became one they'd point to. Proof that the program worked. That talent combined with dedication could lead somewhere real. Through all of this, my family remained silent. I hadn't told them about the book deal, but news traveled in small towns. Ms. Harrison casually mentioned it at church when Mom was within earshot. Eleanor heard about Mom's reaction through the grapevine. She'd gone pale, excused herself, and spent 20 minutes in the bathroom. Dad's response was to tell people I'd probably exaggerated the deal, that small presses barely counted as real publishing. When people looked at my publisher and found it was legitimate and well-respected, he switched tactics. "Well, anyone can write a book. Selling copies is the hard part." The goalposts kept moving. Nothing I did would ever be enough because the problem wasn't my achievements. It was that they existed at all. I committed the unforgivable sin of succeeding without them, of proving I didn't need their approval or support. Chloe's response was more direct. She sent me a long, rambling Instagram message accusing me of flaunting my success to make the family look bad. "You could have told us privately," she wrote. "But no, you had to make a big public spectacle. Everything's always about you." The projection was remarkable. Chloe, who documented her every meal and minor inconvenience on social media, was accusing me of being attention-seeking for existing publicly. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say to someone so fundamentally lacking in self-awareness. What hurt more than their jealousy was the realization that they'd never be happy for me. Not when I got into Princeton. Not when I graduated with honors. Not when I sold a book. No achievement would ever be celebrated because my success was a mirror reflecting their failure to nurture it. Noah's parents, by contrast, threw me a book deal celebration at their house in San Diego. They invited extended family, neighbors, and friends, nearly 50 people, who toasted my success and wanted to hear all about the publishing process. Olivia made a 3-tier cake with published author written in frosting. Noah's father gave a speech about how proud they were to have me in the family, even though we weren't married yet. "This," Noah whispered to me during the party, "is what parents are supposed to act like. Remember this when you doubt yourself." I thought about his words often in the following weeks. My parents had given me one valuable gift, even if unintentionally. They taught me exactly what not to accept as normal. Their dysfunction had calibrated my expectations so precisely that I could recognize genuine love and support when I found it. The summer before graduate school, I finished revising my novel one final time based on Evelyn's editorial notes. She submitted it to publishers in July. Within 3 weeks, we had interest from 2 mid-sized presses. The offers weren't huge, $15,000 for one book, but they were real. "This is just the beginning," Evelyn told me. "Your career is going to be long and successful. Trust the process." 6 months into my MFA program, my debut novel sold. The advance was modest but meaningful enough to cover expenses and validate every choice I'd made. Eleanor cried when I told her. "Your parents have no idea what they lost." "Their loss," I said, echoing Noah's words from years ago. "The world's gain." Publication day came during my second year of graduate school at Washington. The book got strong reviews in trade publications, with several critics praising its unflinching examination of family dynamics and the courage it takes to walk away. Sales were modest but respectable for a literary debut, enough that Evelyn started talking about a second book. A local newspaper in my hometown ran a feature about me, the hometown girl who'd made it as a published author. The article mentioned that I graduated from Princeton and was now at Washington for my MFA. It didn't mention my parents at all because when the journalist had reached out to them for comment, they'd apparently declined. According to Eleanor, who still had connections in town, Mom had a breakdown when the article ran. She'd somehow convinced herself that I'd fail, that I'd eventually come crawling back, begging forgiveness. The publication proved her wrong in the most public way possible. Dad apparently tried to reach out through Eleanor, asking for my contact information. She refused. "Your daughter is thriving without you. Leave her alone." Chloe sent an Instagram message, "I can't believe you wrote a book and didn't tell us. That's so messed up." I left it on read. My second novel came out 3 years later, after I'd finished my MFA and started a PhD program in creative writing at Washington. The reviews were even stronger, the sales better. NPR interviewed me. I did a book tour that filled independent bookstores with readers who connected with my stories about finding yourself outside the expectations others place on you. At a reading in Boston, a young woman approached me during the signing, tears streaming down her face. "Your book made me realize I don't have to keep setting myself on fire to keep my family warm," she said. "Thank you for writing it. These moments made everything worth it." Every painful memory, every moment of doubt, every night I'd wondered if leaving had been selfish, it all led to this, helping others find their own courage. Noah proposed on the beach at sunset, and I said yes before he finished asking. We got married in a small ceremony with Eleanor and Martha, Noah's family, close friends, and Professor Evans, who cried through the entire thing. My parents weren't invited. They'd lost the right to witness my joy. The wedding photos showed everyone who actually mattered, the family I'd chosen, and who'd chosen me back. When I posted them on social media, carefully tagged to exclude my parents and Chloe, I felt nothing but contentment. Eleanor held me close during the reception. "I'm so proud of you. You took the worst thing they ever did and turned it into the best decision of your life." She was right. Being thrown out at 17 had felt like the end of the world. Looking back, it was the beginning of my real life, the moment I stopped trying to earn love from people who'd never freely give it. Now, at 31, with 3 published novels, a PhD defense scheduled for next semester, a husband who cherishes me, and a teaching position lined up at a small liberal arts college, I sometimes think about my parents and Chloe. I wonder if they ever acknowledge their role in everything that fell apart. If Dad ever admits that choosing Chloe's mediocrity over my potential cost him his talented daughter. If Mom ever regrets enabling and defending behavior that ultimately hurt everyone. Probably not. Some people never learn. They'll go to their graves believing they were right, that I was the ungrateful one, that they did nothing wrong. The difference is, I don't need their acknowledgement anymore. I don't need their apology or their pride or their love. I found all of that elsewhere, in people who valued me from the start. That morning, when I said all right and walked away, wasn't the end of my family. It was the end of my obligation to people who'd never valued me. Everything that followed, their social humiliation, their fractured relationships, their golden child's failure to thrive, those were natural consequences of the choices they made. I didn't destroy them. They destroyed themselves. I just refuse to go down with the ship. Sometimes Noah asks if I have any regrets. The answer is always no. Not about leaving, not about staying gone, not about building a life they'll never be part of. They gave me an ultimatum thinking I had no choice. They were wrong. I had every choice, and I chose myself. That choice saved my life. What would you have done?